Sharization, or Islamization, was the primary policy, or centerpiece, of the government of General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, the ruler of Pakistan from 1977 until his death in 1988. Zia has also been called the person most responsible for turning Pakistan into a global center for political Islam. Pakistan had been founded as a separate Muslim-majority state for India, Zia committing himself to enforcing his interpretation of Nizam-e-Mustafa, i.e. establish an Islamic state and Sharia law. Zia established separate Shariat courts and court benches to judge legal cases using Islamic doctrine. New criminal offences and new punishments were added to Pakistani law. Interest payments for bank accounts were replaced by profit and loss payments. Zakat charitable donations became a 2.5% annual tax. School textbooks and libraries were overhauled to remove un-Islamic material. Offices, schools, and factories were required to offer praying space. Zia bolstered the influence of the ulama and the Islamic parties. Conservative scholars became fixtures on television. 10,000 of activists from the Jamaat-e-Islami party were appointed to government posts to ensure the continuation of his agenda after his passing. Conservative ulama were added to the Council of Islamic Ideology. In 1984 a referendum gave Zia and the Islamization program 97.7% approval in official results. However, there have been protests against the laws and their enforcement during and after Zia's reign. Women's and human rights groups opposed incarceration of rape victims under hard punishments. New laws that valued women's testimony and blood money compensation at half that of a man. Religious minorities and human rights groups opposed the vaguely worded Blasphemy Law and the malicious abuse and arbitrary enforcement of it. Possible motivations for the Islamization program included Zia's personal piety, desire to gain political allies, to fulfill Pakistan's raison d'etre as a Muslim state, and/or the political need to legitimize what was seen by some Pakistanis as his repressive, unrepresentative martial law regime. How much success Zia had strengthening Pakistan's national cohesion with state-sponsored Islamization is disputed. Shia-Sunni religious riots broke out over differences in Islamic jurisprudence, in particular over how zakat donations would be distributed. There were also differences among Sunni Muslims. Background and history. Pakistan had been founded as a separate Muslim-majority nation-state for the Muslims of the British Raj, but its legal code was inherited from the British, and was secular, not based on Islamic law. Islamic activists advocating for Islamization have been active throughout the country's post-independence history, but general enthusiasm has waxed and waned, only lip service being paid to the issue at times. Several events in Pakistan and the Muslim world strengthened Islamic revivalism prior to and after the 5th of July 1977 coup that installed Zia to power, including the Saudi financing for propagation of conservative Wahhabism, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In the year or two before the coup, Zia's predecessor, leftist Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto faced vigorous opposition united under the revivist banner of Nizam-e-Mustafa. According to supporters of the movement, establishing an Islamic state based on Sharia law would mean a return to the justice and success of the early days of Islam when the Islamic Prophet Muhammad ruled the Muslims. In an effort to stem the tide of street Islamization, Bhutto had also called for and banned the drinking and selling of wine by Muslims, nightclubs and horse racing. Less than 2 years after the coup, Pakistan's Shia neighbor, Iran, saw a very unexpected Islamic revolution overthrow its well-financed pro-Western, secular monarchy. Although a rival in doctrine and geopolitics, geopolitics to the Saudi kingdom. The new Islamic Republic of Iran also believed in the necessity of Islamic Sharia law for Islam to survive and prosper, and the need to spread this doctrine to other Muslim states. On coming to power, Zia went much further than Bhutto, committing himself to enforcing Nizam-e-Mustafa, i.e. Sharia law. In his first televised speech to the country as head of state, he declared that Pakistan, which was created in the name of Islam, will continue to survive only if it sticks to Islam. That is why I consider the introduction of Islamic system as an essential prerequisite for the country. While in the past, many a ruler did what they pleased in the name of Islam, he would not. Unlike in Iran, Islamization in Pakistan was politically conservative, working against, not with leftist forces and ideas. Zia had little sympathy with Bhutto, his populist, socialist philosophy, captured in the slogan, food, clothing, and shelter. General Zia explained in an interview in 1979 given to British journalist Ian Stevens, the basis of Pakistan was Islam. Muslims of the subcontinent are a separate culture. It was on the two-nation theory that this part was carved out of the subcontinent as Pakistan. Mr. Bhutto's way of flourishing in this society was by eroding its moral fiber. By pitching students against teachers, children against the parents, landlord against tenants, workers against mill owners. Because Pakistanis have been made to believe that one can earn without working. We are going back to Islam not by choice but by the force of circumstances. It is not my government that is imposing Islam. It was what 99% of people wanted. The street violence against Bhutto reflected the people's desire. While Zia initiated the Islamization program, he came under attack from conservative Sunni forces who considered his process too slow. He distanced himself from some of the ulama in 1980, and in 1983 religious opponents spread the rumor that Zia was an Ahmadi. Zia was forced to deny this allegation publicly and denounce the Ahmadis as kafirs. In 1984 a referendum was held on Zia, the Islamization program, and giving him a 5-year presidential term. Official results reported 97.7% in favor and voter participation of 60%. Independent observers questioned whether 30% of eligible voters had voted. Opposition to state-sponsored Islamization or aspects of it came from several quarters. Religious riots broke out in 1983 and 1984. Sectarian divisions between Sunnis and Shia worsened over the issue of the 1979 Zakat Ordinance, but differences in fiqh jurisprudence also arose in marriage and divorce, inheritance and wills, and imposition of had punishments. Among Sunni Muslims, there were disputes between Deobandis and Barelvis. Zia favored Deobandi doctrine, and the Sufi Pirs of Sindh joined the anti-Zia movement for the restoration of democracy. Hudud Ordinance. One of the first and most controversial Islamization measures was the replacement of parts of the Pakistan Penal Code with the 1979 Hudud Ordinance. The ordinance added new criminal offences of adultery and fornication to Pakistani law, and new punishments of whipping, amputation, and stoning to death. For theft or robbery, the PPC punishments of imprisonment or fine, or both, were replaced by amputation of the right hand of the offender for theft, and amputation of the right hand and left foot for robbery. For zina, of the provisions relating to adultery were replaced by the ordinance with punishments of flogged 100 lashes for those unmarried offenders, and stoning to death for married offenders. All these hudud punishments were the maximum punishments, dependent on hud proof, for Muslim men of good repute testifying as witness to the crime being met. In practice, as of 2014, the HUD requirement has not yet been met and no offender has been stoned or had limbs amputated by the Pakistani judicial system. The less strict Zia standards, where the punishment was some combination of imprisonment, fines and/or flogging, was applied and many offenders have been publicly flogged. More worrisome for human rights and women's rights advocates, some lawyers and politicians, was the incarceration of thousands of rape victims on charges of zina. Mixing the Pakistan Penal Code with Islamic laws was difficult because of the difference in the underlying logic of the two legal systems. Prohibition Order. Drinking of wine was not a crime under the original Pakistan Penal Code, but in 1977, the drinking and selling of wine by Muslims was banned in Pakistan, punishable by imprisonment of 6 months or a fine of Rs. 5,000, or both. Under Zia's prohibition order, this punishment was replaced by one of whipping of 80 stripes. Of the companions of Muhammad since the period of the second Caliph Umar, non-Muslims were accepted if they obtained a license to drink and/or manufacture alcoholic beverages from the government. Adultery Ordinance. The most controversial of the ordinances was the Zina Ordinance, by which the Pakistan Penal Code provisions relating to adultery were replaced. Women and men found guilty were to be flogged 100 stripes apiece if unmarried, and stoned to death if married. Uncorroborated testimony by women was inadmissible in hudud crimes, so in cases of rape, victims were sometimes charged with fornication and jailed, and the rapists were freed because the women could not comply with the Islamic had requirements if 4 reputable Muslim males testifying to the crime. Girls as young as 12 were also sometimes jailed and prosecuted for having extramarital intercourse because the ordinance abolished Pakistan's statutory rape law. According to legal scholar Martin Lau, while it was easy to file a case against a woman accusing her of adultery, the Zina Ordinance made it very difficult for a woman to obtain bail pending trial. Worse, in actual practice, the vast majority of accused women were found guilty by the trial court only to be acquitted on appeal to the federal Sharia court. By then they had spent many years in jail, were ostracized by the families, and had become social outcasts. In 1979, before the ordinances went into effect, there were 70 women held in Pakistani prisons. By 1988, there were 6,000. Critics complained that the law had become a way for vengeful husbands and parents to punish the wives or daughters for disobedience, but that, whenever even small changes were proposed, religious groups and political parties staged large-scale demonstrations in opposition. Pakistani women's and human rights groups protested the law, and international media gave it publicity. Supporters defended the ordinance's punishments as ordained by God and the law as the victim of extremely unjust propaganda in the media. The first conviction and sentence of stoning to death, in September 1981, was overturned under national and international pressure. A conviction for adultery of a 13-year-old blind girl, who alleged rape by her employer and his son, was reversed, and the conviction was set aside on appeal after bitter public criticism. Another conviction for zina and sentence of stoning to death in early 1988 sparked more public outrage and led to a retrial and acquittal by the federal Sharia court. Attention to the problematic nature of the ordinance and suggestions for revising it were given by a number of government-appointed commissions, and a several weeks-long televised debate on the subject. In 2006, parts of the law were extensively revised by the Women's Protection Bill, Sharia courts and constitutional amendments. In 1978, Zia established Sharia appellate benches, grafted onto Pakistan's 4 high courts. The benches were tasked with judging legal cases using the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, and examining the country's laws to determine whether they complied with Sharia law and bring them into alignment if they did not. A Sharia appellate bench of the Supreme Court was created to be the final authority in Sharia cases. In announcing the establishment of Sharia benches, Zia described the jurisdiction. Every citizen will have the right to present any law enforced by the government before the Sharia bench, and obtain its verdict whether the law is wholly or partly Islamic or un-Islamic. However, some very important laws were exempt from being struck down as un-Islamic. The 9th Amendment to the Pakistan Constitution, added by Zia's government, stated that the injunctions of Islam as laid down in the Holy Quran and Sunnah shall be the supreme law and source of guidance for legislation, but qualified that in Article 203b by omitting from the rule, the Constitution, Muslim personal law, any law relating to the procedure of any court or tribunal, and, until the expiration of 10 years from the commencement of this chapter, any fiscal law or any law relating to the levy and collection of taxes and fees of banking or insurance practice and procedure. Thus the Constitution and major parts of Pakistan's laws were exempt from Sharia jurisdiction. Further, the Sharia benches did not always follow Zia's policy, and early on declared rajam, or stoning, to be un-Islamic. Zia-ul-Haq reconstituted the court, which then ruled rajam Islamic. In 1980 the Sharia appellate benches were disbanded and replaced by a federal Shariat court. Its establishment was less than clean and simple, as between 1980 and 1985, provisions relating to the FSC's operation were modified 28 times, through the mechanism of 12 separate presidential ordinances, and were incorporated into the Constitution in 14 subsections covering 11 pages of text. It has 8 judges appointed by the President, selected for the most part from judges of the high courts. The judges of the superior courts appointed by General Zia tended to be Islamic moderates, rather than Islamic activists favoring a rapid advance of Islamization. In the lower district courts, there is considerable variation in the enforcement and interpretation of the hudud laws, with much more enthusiasm for implementation of them in the Punjab and urban Khyber Pakhtunkhwa than in other regions. Blasphemy laws. To outlaw blasphemy, the Pakistan Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code were amended through ordinances in 1980, 1982 and 1986. The 1980 law prohibited derogatory remarks against Islamic personages, and carried a 3-year prison sentence. In 1982 the small Ahmadiyya religious minority were prohibited from saying or implying they were Muslims. In 1986 declaring anything that implied disrespect to the Islamic prophet Muhammad al-Bayt Safibur Shari Islam was made a cognizable offense, punishable with imprisonment or fine, or both. Religious offenses and punishments. The legal language forbidding of blasphemy is quite complete, stating whoever, with the deliberate intention of wounding the religious feelings of any person, utters any word or makes any sound in the hearing of the person, or makes any gesture in the sight of the person, or places any object in the sight of the person, shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 1 year, or with fine, or with both. Prior to 1986, only 14 cases pertaining to blasphemy were reported in Pakistan. From 1987 to 2014, over 1,300 people have been accused of blasphemy, mostly non-Muslim religious minorities. The vast majority of the accusations were lodged for desecration of the Quran. The laws are controversial among the small liberal community in Pakistan and international human rights organizations. According to one religious minority source, an accusation of blasphemy commonly subjects the accused, police, lawyers, and judges to harassment, threats, attacks and rioting. Critics complain that Pakistan's blasphemy law is overwhelmingly being used to persecute religious minorities and settle personal vendettas, but calls for change in the blasphemy laws have been strongly resisted by Islamic parties. As of 2014, no one has been legally executed for blasphemy, but 17 people are on death row for the crime, and a considerable number of accused of connected with the issue have been killed at the hands of mob or other vigilante violence. Over 50 people accused of blasphemy have been murdered before the respective trials were over, and prominent figures who opposed blasphemy laws have been assassinated after urging reform of the law. Altogether, since 1990, 62 people have been murdered as a result of blasphemy allegations. There has also been at least one case of an attack on a non-Muslim faith registered under the blasphemy laws. The depth of passion and vigor of vigilantism against blasphemy was in evidence in the 21st of April 1994 incident in Gujranwala, where a doctor, Sajjad Farooq, was beaten, stoned, doused with kerosene and set alight, and dragged through the streets tied to a motorbike by a group of people after an announcement was made over the loudspeakers of several local mosques that a Christian had burned a copy of the Quran, and that people should come forward to stone him to death. It later transpired that Farooq was not a Christian but a devout Muslim, but one with enemies with access to local mosque public address systems. As of late 1994, a complaint had been lodged against 5 people, but no arrests appear to have been made. Economic Islamization. Zakat and USHR Ordinance. The Zakat and USHR Ordinance, 1980, was decreed on June 20, 1980 to empower the government to deduct 2.5% zakat annually from mainly interest-bearing savings and shares held in the National Investment Trust, the Investment Corporation of Pakistan, and other companies of which the majority of shares are owned by the Muslims. The foreign exchange bearer certificate scheme that offered fixed interest was exempted from the zakat deduction. The deductions were made on the first day of Ramadan, with Zia stating that the revenues would be used for poverty relief. Zakat councils were established to oversee distribution of the funds. The ordinance drew sharp criticism from the Shia sect, which was later exempted from the compulsory deduction. Some Sunnis were also critical of the compulsory deduction and the way zakat was distributed. The taxes have not been found to have eliminated rural and urban poverty or reduced the inequalities in wealth which had become a traditional feature of Pakistani society. Zia publicly stated his desire to eliminate interest on loans and securities and create an interest-free economy. Zia declared that effective the 1st of July 1979, the affairs of the National Investment Trust, the House Building Finance Corporation, and the Investment Corporation of Pakistan were to be run on an interest-free basis through the adoption of profit-loss sharing. On January 1, 1980, approximately 7,000 interest-free counters were opened at all the nationalized commercial banks. In 1981, interest payments were to be replaced by profit and loss accounts. The government introduced and encouraged banks to adopt financing schemes based upon Murabah and Musharaka land reforms. Zia did not consider land reform a trade union activity property to be part of Islamic economics. In a statement addressed to the poor and working class, he opined, "It is not for the employers to provide roti, kapda, makan. It was for God Almighty, who is the provider of livelihood to his people. Trust in God and he will bestow upon you an abundance of good things in life." His martial law government also made it clear that it was not committed to redistributive agrarian policies and described the land reforms as ordinary politics to reward supporters and punish enemies. When on December 13, 1980, the Federal Sharia Court declared the land reforms of 1972 and 1977 to be in consonance with Islamic injunctions, Zia responded by inducting 3 members of the ulama into the Federal Sharia Court and 2 into the Sharia Appellate Bench of the Supreme Court. The newly constituted courts reversed the FSC judgment in 1990. After the imposition of martial law, thousands of tenants were forcibly evicted from the land in various districts. Another source, scholar Charles H. Kennedy, states that from 1978 to 1992, the Islamic courts established by Islamization were much more important in land reform policy than either the executive or legislature of Pakistan. Kennedy states they effectively suspended implementation of the land reforms, repealed the reforms, drafted new legislation, and then interpreted the new laws' meanings. Worker protests, trade union and grassroots demands for higher wages, better working conditions, social security, old age benefits and compensation for accidents were no justification for protests and strikes, and treated as disorder to be suppressed. Maximum punishment to the offenders was 3 years rigorous imprisonment and/or whipping. On January 2, 1986, police killed 19 striking workers of the Colony Textile Mill in Multan, whose management had sought assistance from the authorities. Other Sharia laws. Attempts were made to enforce praying of Salat 5 times a day. Separate electorates for Hindus and Christians were established in 1985, a policy originally proposed by Islamist leader Abul Maududi. Christian and Hindu leaders complained that they felt excluded from county's political process, but the policy had strong support from Islamists. In 1990, criminal law ordinance on qisas and diyat was introduced after the Sharia Appellate Bench of the Supreme Court declared that the lack of qisas and diyat were repugnant to the injunctions of Islam as laid down by the Quran and Sunnah. Under the law, the victim of a crime had the right to inflict injuries on the offender identical to the ones sustained by the victim. The law also allows offenders to absolve themselves of the crime by paying compensation to the victim or their heirs if, and only if, the family of the victim is willing to accept it. Law of evidence. A proposed law of evidence would require 2 women to testify in place of 1 man. After protest and demonstrations against the law, a 1984 compromise limited the rule to financial transactions. According to Charles Kennedy, it is unlikely that the law will have an impact on any case brought to any superior court in Pakistan because, in practice, virtually every financial transaction in Pakistan by customer rule requires the counter-signature of several individuals. Unlike men, women entering into legal contracts were required to have the signature witnessed by another person. Prayer timings instructions were issued for regular observance of prayers and arrangements were made for performing noon prayer in government and quasi-government offices and educational institutions, during office hours, and official functions, and at airports, railway stations and bus stops. Ramadan Ordinance. An Adultery Ramazan Ordinance was issued banning eating, smoking, and drinking in public places. According to a clause of this ordinance, those places including restaurants, canteens, bridges, lanes, and even the confines of private homes. While in theory the non-Muslim minority of Pakistan is exempt from the law, minorities have been arrested for eating in public. Regulations for women under Zia, the order for women to cover their heads while in public, was implemented in public schools, colleges and state television. Women's participation in sports and the performing arts was severely restricted. The Ansari Commission, which from the 1980s onwards advised the president on un-Islamic social conventions, recommended that women should be prohibited from leaving the country without a male escort and that unmarried, unaccompanied women should not be allowed to serve overseas in the diplomatic corps. An Islamic dress code was imposed on women in the public eye, such as newsreaders and air stewardesses.